At 2 p.m. on the 1st of September 1894, the sky above Hinckley, Minnesota, was darkening in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. The town, a railroad settlement of about 1,400 people nestled in the pine forests east of the Mississippi, had been suffering through an unusually dry summer. The ground was parched. The woods were tinder. And for the previous month, small fires had been burning in the surrounding region, some set by logging operations, others by sparks from locomotives, some by lightning that had struck weeks ago and never fully died out. By late August, the air smelled of smoke almost constantly. People had grown used to it. But on this Saturday, the fires that had been creeping along the forest floor began to converge. What followed in the next 4 hours would destroy the town, kill at least 418 people, and scar the landscape so completely that the government would later set aside the land as a memorial. The Hinckley Fire of 1894 is not the deadliest wildfire in American history. That title belongs to Peshtigo. But it is one of the most studied, not only because of the speed with which it moved, but because of the decisions made by a handful of railroad employees who, with little more than a telegraph key and a steam engine, managed to save several hundred lives while others burned. At 2:15 p.m., the telegraph operator at the Hinckley Depot, a man named Tommy Dunn, received a message from the station at Mission Creek, 8 miles to the west. It said, "Fire coming this way." Dunn looked outside. He could see a column of smoke on the horizon, but it did not seem urgent. He sent a message back asking for more details. The reply came quickly: "Fire has jumped the track. It is moving fast." Dunn then alerted the local hotel, the merchants, and the postmaster. He also tried to reach the operator in Sandstone, a smaller town to the north, but the line went dead. At 2:30 p.m., the fire was visible from the streets of Hinckley. People gathered on the boardwalks and watched. It was not a wall of flame yet. It was a rolling cloud of gray and brown smoke, with occasional orange pulses deep inside. The wind was blowing from the southwest at an estimated 30 miles per hour. Under normal conditions, a forest fire might move at a walking pace, but this was not a normal fire. The drought had dried the needles on the pine trees to the point where they could ignite from the heat of a passing flame before the flame ever touched them. The ground was covered with decades of fallen branches and logging slash, left behind by the lumber companies that had clear-cut the hills for years. The debris had not been cleaned up. It formed a carpet of fuel that was inches thick, sometimes feet deep. And the fire had been building for weeks, waiting for the right wind. At 2:45 p.m., a train arrived at the Hinckley Depot. It was a mixed train, carrying passengers and freight, heading south from Duluth. The engineer was a man named James Root. He had already seen heavy smoke to the south as he approached, but the depot agents told him the fire was still west of town. Root decided to rest the engine and wait for orders. He did not know that within 20 minutes he would be running for his life. At 3 p.m., the fire reached the western edge of Hinckley. It did not come as a line of flames. It came as a blast of superheated air, followed by a shower of burning embers that flew ahead of the main front. Houses with wooden shingles caught fire instantly. The church steeple ignited. The hotel, a large wooden structure, went up in moments. People who were still on the streets began running toward the railroad tracks, which seemed like the only open space. The fire was now blowing through town with such force that the flames were not walking along the ground. They were being thrown horizontally. At 3:05 p.m., telegraph operator Dunn sent a final message. "The town is on fire. We are leaving." He did not sign off. He simply stopped sending. At 3:10 p.m., James Root saw that the fire had surrounded the depot. He ordered his train to begin moving backward south out of town. He had only the locomotive, a tender, and a few cars. There was no time to connect more cars. The steam pressure was low because he had been idling. He knew he might not have enough power to outrun the fire. He opened the throttle as far as it would go. The train lurched backward, leaving the station just as the depot roof caught fire. But Root was not the only one trying to escape. At the same moment, another train was approaching Hinckley from the north. It was a freight train with a few passenger cars, pulled by locomotive number 15. The engineer, John Blair, had seen the smoke from miles away and had been slowing down to assess the situation. As he neared the town, he saw that the tracks ahead were already on fire. The wooden railroad ties were burning. The rails themselves were beginning to warp from the heat. He had to make a decision. Stop the train and try to ride out the fire in the open, or push forward into town and hope he could get past it. Blair drove forward through the flames. The train passed through a curtain of fire. The heat shattered the windows of the passenger cars. People inside threw themselves onto the floors, covering their faces with coats and blankets. The wood on the sides of the cars began to char, but the train kept moving. Blair reached the depot, but by then the entire town was ablaze. He could not stop. He continued north, beyond Hinckley, out of the main fire zone, and stopped on a trestle over a small river. The passengers disembarked and climbed down to the water, where they stayed until the fire passed. Meanwhile, James Root was still backing his train south down the line. He knew he had to reach a crossing called Skunk Lake, about 1.5 miles away, where there was a pond. If he could get there, he might be able to stop and let the people take refuge in the water. But the fire was closing in on both sides of the track. The heat in the cab was unbearable. Root later said that the metal on the throttle handle burned his hand, but he did not let go. At 3:25 p.m., Root reached Skunk Lake. He stopped the train and shouted to the passengers to get out and run for the water. About 300 people had been on the train or had jumped aboard as it left. They poured off the cars and plunged into the pond. Some did not make it. The fire came over the tracks so fast that it overtook those who had hesitated. The heat set fire to the water itself, in places where bubbles of natural gas from the decaying vegetation broke the surface and ignited. People in the pond submerged their heads, coming up for air only long enough to see the entire forest on fire, the sky turning black, and the sound of a roar so loud that one survivor described it as 1,000 trains passing at once. At 3:35 p.m., the firestorm was complete. The temperature at ground level in the center of the burn reached an estimated 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees exploded. The sand in the soil vitrified into glass. The fire created its own weather. It generated a column of hot air that rose vertically, pulling in fresh oxygen from all sides, accelerating the burn. This is what modern fire scientists call a fire whirl. It can lift burning debris miles into the air. The columns of smoke from the Hinckley Fire were visible from 60 miles away. The fire consumed an area of about 400 square miles in 4 hours. That is a rate of 100 square miles per hour. A forest fire moving at that speed is not a fire. It is a hurricane made of flame. How did it happen? The Hinckley Fire was not a single event. It was the culmination of several factors, each of which on its own might have been manageable but when combined created a catastrophe. The first factor was the weather. The summer of 1894 had been one of the driest on record. From June through August, rainfall in eastern Minnesota was less than half of normal. The humidity dropped. The trees lost moisture. The soil cracked. By the 1st of September, the forest was not just dry. It was desiccated. The second factor was the fuel. Minnesota in the 1890s was the center of the American lumber industry. The white pine forests had been logged heavily for 2 decades. The lumber companies did not clear the debris. They left behind piles of branches, bark, and sawdust that were often several feet deep. In some places, the slash covered the ground so completely that a person could not walk through it without sinking. That material was dried to the point of explosive flammability. The third factor was the wind. On September 1st, a cold front moved across Minnesota from the northwest. It collided with warm, stagnant air over the burned-over regions. The result was a pressure gradient that drove a strong, sustained wind from the southwest. That wind carried the flames directly into the towns of Hinckley, Sandstone, and several smaller settlements. It also prevented any backfires from being effective. Firefighters in that era had few tools. They could dig fire breaks, they could try to wet down buildings, and they could set backfires to burn out fuel ahead of the main blaze. but with a wind of 30 miles per hour, a backfire would not stay down. It would jump the break and become part of the main fire. The fourth factor was the lack of warning. The existing fire detection system in Minnesota in 1894 was minimal. There were no aircraft, no satellites, no radio. Communication relied on telegraph lines, which were vulnerable to fire themselves. When the fire cut the lines to Hinckley, the town lost contact with the outside world. The only warning that reached the residents came from the telegraph operator at Mission Creek, who transmitted his message just before his own station burned. He did not survive. The fire killed him and his family. The fifth factor was human error. In the weeks leading up to the fire, lumbermen and settlers had been burning debris piles to clear land. These small fires, combined with sparks from passing locomotives, had started dozens of smaller blazes. State officials had issued warnings, but there was no enforcement. The lumber industry was powerful. The idea that a fire could grow this large was not taken seriously. Even on the morning of September 1st, the fire was burning south of Hinckley, but it was considered too far away to need immediate action. By the time it turned, it was too late. The sixth factor was the geography. The region around Hinckley is relatively flat and densely forested. There are few natural barriers. The fire had no rivers, no rock outcroppings, no swamps wide enough to stop it. It ran unimpeded until it reached the St. Croix River to the east and the Mississippi to the west. Only then did it slow. Who was involved? The victims were loggers, farmers, merchants, railroad workers, and their families. The town of Hinckley had about 1,400 people at the time of the fire. The official death toll was placed at 418, but many bodies were never recovered. The heat was so intense that some victims simply ceased to exist. The only remains in some cases were a few teeth or a buckle. The true number may be higher. Some accounts put it at more than 500. The survivors included the passengers of the two trains. Root's train saved about 300 people. Blair's train saved another 150. Without those two engineers, the death toll would have been far worse. Root and Blair both survived, though Root was severely burned. He had to be treated for months. Both men were later commended for their actions, but they never considered themselves heroes. Root said simply, "I did what had to be done." What investigators found in the aftermath was a landscape that looked nothing like the forest that had stood there that morning. The entire region was black. Trees were stripped of branches and bark, reduced to bare poles. The ground was covered in ash up to a foot deep. The stench of smoke and death hung over the area for weeks. The investigators, mostly railroad officials and state foresters, interviewed survivors and mapped the burn. They calculated the speed of the fire, the direction of the wind, and the behavior of the smoke column. They concluded that the fire had not simply spread along the ground, but had traveled through the crown of the forest, leaping from treetop to treetop, driven by a wind that was itself created by the fire. This was one of the first serious efforts in the United States to understand the physics of a wildfire. The Hinckley Fire became a case study in fire behavior. It was used to argue for better fire prevention laws, for the clearing of logging slash, and for the establishment of a forest fire warning system. It also led to changes in railroad operation. Locomotives were required to be equipped with spark arresters. Track crews were trained to clear brush along the right-of-way. None of these reforms came quickly. The lumber industry resisted, but the evidence from Hinckley was too powerful to ignore. The fire also changed the town. Hinckley was rebuilt, but not on the same scale. Many survivors moved away. The town never regained its pre-fire population. The harbor of families was broken. The children who had lost parents were taken in by relatives or, in some cases, by strangers. The state established an orphanage for the survivors. The event matters today because it is a reminder that fire does not respect boundaries. The same conditions that made the Hinckley Fire possible exist in many parts of the American West and elsewhere. Drought, accumulated fuel, and strong winds are the ingredients for a firestorm. Human development on the edge of wildlands puts more people at risk. The Hinckley Fire was contained in 4 hours, but it took decades to understand what had happened and to implement the lessons learned. Even now, the question of how to prevent such fires remains urgent. Modern firefighting resources are far superior. Aircraft, bulldozers, and fire retardant can slow or stop many fires, but under extreme conditions, no amount of equipment can stop a fire that is generating its own weather. The Hinckley Fire was a fire that did that. It burned with such intensity that it created a column of heated air that pulled in everything around it. That is the same phenomenon that powers modern megafires in California, Australia, and Canada. What happened in Hinckley in those 4 hours is not a historical oddity. It is a template. It shows how quickly a small fire can turn into a catastrophe, how fragile our communication systems are in the face of disaster, how dependent we are on a few individuals who make the right decisions under impossible pressure, and how easy it is to ignore warnings until it is too late. The story of the Hinckley Fire is the story of a town that burned, but it is also the story of a system that failed. The lumber companies failed to clear their slash. The state failed to enforce fire laws. The weather failed to cooperate, and the telegraph lines failed at the moment they were most needed. But there were also moments of success. The courage of the engineers, the quick thinking of the telegraph operator, the survival instinct of hundreds of people who ran into a lake while the forest burned around them. In the end, the Hinckley Fire is not only about destruction. It is about resilience. It is about what happens when a community is reduced to ash and must decide whether to rise again. It is about the questions that remain unanswered. Why did some survive while others perished just a few feet away? Could more have been done to warn the town? And what would happen if the same conditions returned, not in 1894 but today? At 8 a.m. on September 2, 1894, the sun rose over a landscape that no longer resembled the one that had existed 24 hours earlier. The town of Hinckley was not a town anymore. It was a field of ash and twisted metal. The railroad depot, the hotel, the churches, the stores, the homes, all were gone. The only structures still standing were the foundations of a few brick buildings, their walls cracked and blackened, their interiors hollowed out by heat. The bodies of the dead lay where they had fallen. Some were curled in the streets, their hands over their faces. Others were found huddled in cellars, trapped when the flames consumed the oxygen. A few were never found. The fire had been so intense that it had consumed bones, teeth, and even the brass buttons on coats. The ground was so hot that rescuers could not walk on it without wooden boards strapped to their boots. The air was thick with fine gray ash that stuck to everything. The stench of burned flesh and wet charcoal hung over the area for weeks. What happened in the hours after the fire was a slow, methodical accounting of the dead. The first to arrive were railroad crews from the north and south. They came with handcars and work trains, carrying shovels, ropes, and water. They found the tracks buckled from the heat. Telegraph poles were reduced to stumps. The wires lay tangled on the ground. The crews walked into Hinckley and began pulling bodies from the rubble. They did not have body bags. They used blankets, tarps, anything they could find. The dead were laid in rows along the railroad right-of-way. By nightfall on September 2nd, the count had reached 200. It kept rising. The official response from the state was slow. Minnesota's governor, Newt Nelson, was in St. Paul, about 90 miles away. He received word by messenger. No telegraph lines were working south of Hinckley. He ordered relief supplies, food, blankets, tents, medicine, but the railroad tracks were damaged. The first relief train did not arrive until the morning of September 3rd. By that time, the survivors had already begun leaving on foot. They walked south along the tracks, past the burned forests, past the carcasses of deer and cattle, past the empty shells of houses. Some walked all the way to St. Paul. Others stopped at small settlements that had been spared. The town of Pine City, 20 miles south of Hinckley, took in hundreds of refugees. They housed them in churches, barns, and schoolhouses. The Red Cross did not yet have a permanent presence in Minnesota, but local chapters mobilized quickly. Women's groups in Minneapolis and St. Paul sewed clothing and prepared food. Doctors from the Twin Cities traveled north by train and then by horse-drawn wagon. They set up field hospitals in improvised tents. There was no penicillin, no antibiotics, no modern burn treatment. Infections were common. Amputations were performed with saws and a bottle of whiskey. Who were the survivors? The passengers of the two trains were the most visible group. The train that James Root had backed into Hinckley carried about 300 people. Many of them had been burned. Root himself was badly injured. He had stayed at the throttle long enough to pull the train forward 3 miles to safety, but the fire had reached him through the open cab window. His hands and face were seared. He was treated in a local home and later transferred to a hospital in St. Paul. He lost the use of his fingers for a time. He never regained full feeling in them. The other engineer, John Blair, had driven his train east through the fire at full speed. He had arrived in Duluth with a train full of terrified passengers. He was not seriously injured, but he was shaken. He told reporters that he had never seen such a sight. He described the fire as a wall of flame that reached up to the sky. He said the wind was so strong that it pushed the train sideways on the tracks. He had to keep the throttle open just to stay upright. The survivors from the town itself included many who had reached the gravel pit and the small lakes. Those who hid in the gravel pit told a similar story. They had to submerge themselves in the water, cover their faces with wet cloths, and wait. The fire poured over them. The heat was so intense that the water around them began to boil. Some people screamed as the boiling water burned their skin. Others fainted from the lack of oxygen. When the fire passed, they emerged to find that their clothes had been burned off their backs. They had to walk naked or in rags to the nearest shelter. The survivors of the gravel pit were found by the train crews. They were given coats and blankets. Many of them had degree burns over large portions of their bodies. They were taken to hospitals in Duluth and St. Paul, but the mortality rate was high. Infection set in quickly. Without proper wound care, even moderate burns could kill within days. The children suffered the most. The fire killed entire families. Parents had pushed their children into wells and cisterns, but some of those wells were shallow and the water was not deep enough. The children suffocated in the smoke. Others were found beneath their parents' bodies, shielded from the direct flame but not from the heat. They died of thermal shock. The orphanage that was established later housed over 100 children. Some were too young to remember their own names. They were listed as unknown in the records. Local families adopted many of them. Others were sent to state institutions. The trauma stayed with them for life. Decades later, survivors wrote letters to each other, recalling the sound of the fire. They described it as a roar that never stopped, a sound like 1,000 freight trains passing at once. What did investigators find when they examined the scene more closely? The state assigned a commission to study the fire. They interviewed every survivor they could find. They mapped the burn scar, which covered over 400 square miles. They measured the depth of the ash. They studied the direction of the wind and the speed of the fire. They concluded that the fire had moved at an average speed of 15 miles per hour, but at its peak, it had moved at 30 to 40 miles per hour. That was fast enough to outrun a horse at full gallop. The fire had crossed open fields and roads without slowing. It had jumped the St. Croix River in places, carried by burning embers that had been lifted high into the air. Those embers had been the size of baseballs. They had stayed hot enough to start new fires on the far side of the river. The commission also looked at the role of the lumber industry. They found that logging slash, the branches, bark, and wood chips left behind after trees were cut, had been left in huge piles. The piles were dry. They had been burning for weeks before September 1st. The small fires that settlers and lumbermen had set to clear land had not been properly extinguished. The commission recommended that all slash be burned under controlled conditions. They recommended that railroads be required to maintain spark arresters, and that track crews be trained to clear vegetation. They recommended that the state establish a forest fire detection system using watchtowers and telephone lines. But the lumber industry pushed back. The industry argued that the fire was an act of God, not a result of negligence. They said that no amount of regulation could have stopped it. The Commission's report was published, but few of its recommendations were enacted immediately. It took another major fire, the Baudette Fire of 1910, before Minnesota passed meaningful fire prevention laws. The Hinckley Fire also had a profound effect on the national conversation about wildfires. In the years that followed, federal forestry officials began to study fire behavior more systematically. They realized that the Hinckley Fire was not unique. It was part of a pattern of large, fast-moving fires that were becoming more common as settlement expanded into fire-prone regions. The Great Fire of 1871, which had burned the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and killed over 1,500 people, was still fresh in memory. The two fires shared many characteristics: drought, high winds, and abundant fuel. The Hinckley Fire reinforced the idea that wildfires could be self-sustaining, that they could produce their own winds and spread in ways that defied conventional firefighting. How did the survivors rebuild? Hinckley was not abandoned. The railroad still needed a stop there. The lumber industry still wanted to harvest the timber that had not burned. The town was rebuilt on the same site, but slowly. The first structures were temporary shacks made from salvaged wood. By 1895, a new depot had been built. By 1900, the town had a population of about 600, less than half of what it had been before the fire. The new buildings were made of brick. The streets were wider. The town planted trees along the main road, a gesture of hope, but the memory of the fire never faded. Every year on September 1st, the town held a memorial. Survivors gathered at the cemetery. They read the names of the dead. They placed flowers on the graves. The tradition continued into the 193's rows when most of the survivors had died. What about the long-term legacy? The Hinckley Fire became a textbook case in fire ecology. It showed that severe fires could reset a forest ecosystem entirely. The pine forests that had existed before the fire were replaced by aspen and birch, which grow faster after a disturbance. The wildlife that returned was different. Deer and moose thrived in the new growth. The fire had created a mosaic of habitats. Ecologists later pointed to Hinckley as an example of how fire can be a natural part of a forest's life cycle, even when it is catastrophic. But that perspective was a long time coming. In the immediate aftermath, the fire was seen as a disaster that could have been prevented. The question of prevention haunted the state for decades. The fire also changed how Americans thought about wildfire. Before Hinckley, many people believed that forest fires were unavoidable, that they were simply part of living in the woods. After Hinckley, there was a growing sense that fires could be controlled, that human activity had made them worse, and that government had a responsibility to protect its citizens. That belief led to the creation of the Minnesota State Forestry Board in 1895, the first state agency of its kind in the region. It led to the establishment of fire patrols and fire towers. It led to the training of local fire wardens. These were small steps, but they laid the foundation for the modern wildfire management system. The Hinckley Fire also influenced the railroad industry. The use of spark arresters became standard. The practice of clearing brush along the tracks became routine. The railroads began to monitor their own right-of-ways more closely. They also began to cooperate with state forestry officials, sharing information about fire starts. This cooperation was not always consistent, but it marked a shift from the days when the railroads had denied any responsibility for fires. Investigations after Hinckley had found that at least 3 of the smaller fires that preceded the main blaze had been started by locomotives. The evidence was clear. The railroads had to change. In the end, the Hinckley Fire remains a story about human fallibility and human courage. The fallibility is easy to see. The failure to clear slash, the failure to regulate the railroads, the failure to build fire-safe homes, the failure to warn the town. The courage is just as visible. The engineers who drove their trains through the fire, the telegraph operator who sent his final message, the parents who shielded their children, the strangers who helped each other in the gravel pit and the lake. The fire destroyed a town, but it also revealed the best and worst of human nature under extreme pressure. Today, the Hinckley Fire is remembered in museum exhibits, historical markers, and a book titled The Hinckley Fire of 1894 by a local historian. The site of the fire is now part of the St. Croix State Forest. Visitors can walk the trails and see the regrown forest. They can read the markers that describe what happened. They can stand at the gravel pit and imagine what it was like to be surrounded by fire with no way out. The story does not end with the last survivor. It continues in every wildfire season, in every community that faces the same conditions, in every warning that goes unheeded. The Hinckley Fire was not the last fire of its kind. It was only the first to be studied so carefully. The lessons it taught remain as urgent as they were in 1894. Consider the case of a single family, the O'Briens. At 1:47 in the afternoon on September 1, 1894, James O'Brien returned to his farm 3 miles east of Hinckley. He had been working in the fields since dawn. The sky had been hazy all morning, but by early afternoon the haze had thickened into a low, brownish ceiling. He saw a faint glow on the southwestern horizon. He thought it was a controlled burn. He had seen dozens of them that summer. He walked toward the house to tell his wife to prepare lunch. By the time he reached the door, the glow had turned into a distinct wall of flame. He later estimated that it was still 4 miles away, but he could feel the heat on his face. He told his wife to grab the children and head for the creek. He would follow with the livestock. He did not know that the creek was already dry. The drought had lowered it to a trickle. When the fire arrived 11 minutes later, the O'Brien family was standing in 6 inches of muddy water. They survived by throwing wet blankets over their heads and staying low as the firestorm passed overhead. The barn burned. The house burned. The crops burned. But the family lived. James O'Brien later told reporters that the fire sounded like 1,000 trains at once. He said the noise was so loud that he could not hear his own children screaming. What made that fire so loud? The answer lies in the physics of a firestorm. When a wildfire grows large enough and hot enough, it begins to create its own weather. The heat rises so rapidly that it pulls in surrounding air at hurricane force. That entrushing air feeds the fire with oxygen and drives it forward. In Hinckley, the fire generated a convection column that reached an estimated 20,000 feet into the atmosphere. At the top of that column, the ash and embers mixed with cold air and fell back to Earth, starting new fires miles ahead of the main front. This process, called spotting, was one of the reasons the fire moved so fast. The embers that fell ahead of the flame front were not just small sparks. They were burning chunks of bark and wood the size of a man's fist. They could stay hot for more than a mile as they traveled through the air. When they landed, they ignited the ground immediately. The fire did not spread as a solid wall. It jumped. It skipped over roads and rivers. It surrounded survivors before they knew they were surrounded. The fire also produced a phenomenon known as a fire whirl. Fire whirls are rotating columns of hot gas and flame that can reach hundreds of feet in height. They behave like tornadoes. They can lift entire buildings off their foundations. They can throw burning logs across wide clearings. Several survivors reported seeing a giant funnel of fire near the town of Hinckley around 2:30 in the afternoon. One witness said it looked like a burning rope connecting the ground to the sky. Another said it moved erratically, spinning debris in a circle before collapsing. The fire whirl lasted only a few minutes, but it destroyed a half-mile swath of forest that had not yet been touched by the main fire. It was one of the first documented observations of a fire whirl in North America. Meteorologists later studied the accounts and concluded that the Hinckley Fire whirl was likely a Class F2 event, with winds between 100 and 150 miles per hour. How did the fire create its own wind? The answer is differential heating. As the fire burned, it heated the air above it to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That hot air expanded rapidly and rose at speeds of 100 miles per hour or more. The rising air created a low-pressure zone at the surface. Air from the surrounding area rushed in to fill that low-pressure zone. The entrushing air brought more oxygen. The oxygen intensified the fire. The fire grew hotter. The cycle accelerated. In Hinckley, the wind from the fire itself may have been stronger than the ambient wind that had been blowing from the southwest. The fire began to dictate its own direction. It did not follow the existing wind pattern. It created its own. That is why the burn scar was not a simple teardrop shape. It was irregular, with fingers of burned land extending in several directions. The fire had turned into a self-propelled engine of destruction. For the people in the path of that engine, survival depended on speed and luck. The O'Briens were lucky. They were close to water. Others were not. At 2:55 in the afternoon, a man named Henry Miller was driving his wagon along the road north of Hinckley. He had a load of lumber that he was taking to a sawmill. He saw the fire approaching from the south. He whipped his horses. The horses ran. The fire caught the wagon 3 minutes later. Miller jumped from the wagon and ran into a nearby field. The fire overtook him there. His body was found the next day, lying face down with his arms covering his head. The lumber in the wagon had been completely consumed. The metal axles and wheels were twisted from the heat. At 3:10, a group of about 40 people huddled in a small pond half a mile east of the town of Sandstone. They had seen the fire coming and had waded into the water up to their necks. They held wet cloths over their mouths. The fire passed over them in less than 10 minutes. When it was over, they emerged to find the world around them black and smoking. The trees had been stripped of bark. The ground was hot to the touch. Several people had severe burns on their faces and hands. One woman, Margaret Sullivan, had inhaled superheated air. She died 3 hours later from respiratory failure. The autopsy later showed that her lungs were charred internally. What did doctors learn from these deaths? The Hinckley Fire provided one of the first large-scale case studies of burn injuries and smoke inhalation in a civilian disaster. Physicians from St. Paul and Minneapolis traveled to the scene to treat survivors. They documented the types of injuries: degree burns, carbon monoxide poisoning, lung damage from hot gases. They noted that many victims who appeared uninjured on the outside had internal damage from breathing superheated air. The air temperature near the flame front had been estimated at over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Even a few breaths of air that hot could cause fatal swelling of the airway. The doctors also observed that people who had sheltered in water tended to survive with less severe burns, but they were still at risk from heat stroke and dehydration. The body temperature of many survivors had risen dangerously high during the fire. Some were found unconscious in the water, not because they had drowned, but because their core temperature had exceeded 105 degrees. The medical response was hampered by the destruction of roads and bridges. The first doctors did not arrive in Hinckley until late on the night of September 1st. They had to travel by train because the roads were impassable. The trains that arrived carried not only doctors but also supplies: bandages, morphine, disinfectant, blankets, and food. The relief effort was organized by the Red Cross, which had been founded only 13 years earlier. The Hinckley Fire was one of the first major disaster responses for the American Red Cross. Clara Barton, the organization's founder, personally led the relief team. She arrived in Hinckley on September 3rd. She later wrote that the scene was beyond description. She set up a tent hospital near the railroad tracks. She organized teams to search for survivors, distribute food, and bury the dead. The Red Cross stayed in Hinckley for 6 weeks. What did Clara Barton and her team discover about the scale of the disaster? They found that many survivors had walked for miles through the burned landscape, sometimes carrying injured family members. They found families that had been separated and had no way of knowing if their loved ones were alive. They found children who had been orphaned. The Red Cross set up a registry to help people find each other. They also set up a morgue. The bodies were so badly burned that identification was often impossible. Many were buried in mass graves. The largest mass grave was in the Hinckley Cemetery, where 248 unidentified victims were interred. A simple stone marker was erected. It read only, "Unknown." died September 1, 1894. The process of identifying the dead was slow. Families from surrounding towns came to look at the bodies that had been laid out in rows in a temporary building. They walked past the remains, searching for any recognizable feature: a piece of clothing, a ring, a shoe. Some survivors recognized their own children by the boots they were wearing or by a distinctive belt buckle. Others never found closure. The official death count was eventually set at 418, but historians believe the true number was higher. Many itinerant workers and transient lumberjacks had been living in the area without being registered. Their bodies were never found. The fire had been so intense that it had completely consumed some victims, leaving no remains at all. The fire also destroyed evidence of the initial causes. The commission had identified several small fires that had been burning before September 1st, but they could not say with certainty which one had escalated into the disaster. The most likely candidate was a slash fire set by a farmer named John A. Johnson. Johnson had been clearing land on the west side of the Kettle River. He had started a fire on August 30th to burn brush. He thought he had extinguished it. But the drought had dried the ground so thoroughly that the fire had smoldered underground for 2 days, then re-emerged on September 1st when the wind picked up. Johnson later denied responsibility. He said he had put the fire out completely, but neighbors testified that they had seen embers still glowing in his field on the morning of September 1st. The commission did not assign official blame, but the circumstantial evidence pointed to Johnson's fire as the likely ignition point. What about the role of the railroad? The Eastern Minnesota Railway had been running trains through the area all summer. Locomotives using coal or wood threw off hot sparks. The tracks passed through miles of dry brush and logging slash. Several witnesses reported seeing small fires along the railroad tracks in the weeks before September 1st. The railroad had assigned section crews to patrol the tracks and extinguish any fires, but the crews were small and the area was large. On the day of the fire, a train from the north had passed through Hinckley at around 1:30 in the afternoon. Passengers later said they saw flames along the tracks just south of town. The fire may have been accelerated by that train's passage. The sparks from the locomotive could have ignited fresh fuel directly ahead of the main fire. The commission noted this possibility but did not investigate further because the railroad refused to release its records. The resistance of the railroad to cooperate was a sign of the times. In the 1890s, corporations had enormous power and little accountability. The railroad companies argued that fires were a natural occurrence and that they could not be held liable for every spark that escaped from a locomotive. They hired lawyers to fight any attempt to make them pay damages. After the Hinckley Fire, dozens of lawsuits were filed against the Eastern Minnesota Railway and other railroads. Most were dismissed or settled out of court for small amounts. The families of victims received little compensation. The railroad companies paid a fraction of the losses. The lumber industry also avoided liability. They claimed that the slash piles were a necessary byproduct of logging and that the fire was an act of God. The courts largely agreed. The legal aftermath of the Hinckley Fire established a pattern that would repeat itself in later disasters. The blame was diffuse, the victims received inadequate compensation, and the industries responsible continued operating with minimal regulation. It took the Peshtigo Fire of 1871, which killed more than 1,500 people, and the Hinckley Fire, which killed more than 400, to finally push state governments to act. Wisconsin passed its first forest fire prevention laws in 1872, but enforcement was weak. Minnesota followed in 1895, but the laws were not comprehensive until after the 1910 fire season, which saw catastrophic fires across the western United States. Those fires, including the Great Fire of 1910 in Idaho and Montana, killed 87 people and burned 3 million acres. They prompted the federal government to create the U.S. Forest Service's Fire Management Program, and yet even then the lessons from Hinckley were not fully applied. How could that be? Because the memory of disaster fades, people rebuild. They assume it will not happen again. The forest grows back. New residents move in. They do not know what happened before. In Hinckley, the survivors who rebuilt had a vivid memory of the fire, but their children and grandchildren did not. By 1910, many of the original survivors had moved away or died. The town had a new generation that had never seen the sky turn black at noon. The memorial services became smaller. The stories became less detailed. The fire passed from living memory into recorded history, but the landscape remembered. The aspen and birch that grew after the fire were different from the pine that had been there before. Ecologists later determined that the Hinckley Fire had fundamentally changed the forest composition. The pine forest that had existed for centuries was replaced by a mixed hardwood forest. That new forest was less flammable than the pine forest, at least in the short term. But as the aspen and birch aged, they were replaced by more flammable species. By the 193's rose, the area was again vulnerable to fire. In 1934, another drought year, a fire broke out near the same region. It burned tens of thousands of acres. It did not kill anyone because the area was less populated, but it was a reminder that the conditions were still present. Today, the Hinckley Fire is studied not only as a historical event, but as a precedent for understanding extreme fire behavior. Climate scientists have pointed out that the drought of 1894 was part of a larger pattern of climate variability. The summer had been dry across the upper Midwest. The temperatures had been above average. The humidity had been low. These conditions are becoming more common in the 21st century. In 2021, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration published a study that linked the frequency of large fires in Minnesota to rising temperatures and earlier snowmelt. The study noted that the 1894 fire occurred during a period that was cooler than today, but the underlying conditions, dry fuel, high winds, human ignitions, were the same. The researchers concluded that if a fire like Hinckley occurred today, with modern population density, the death toll could be higher, despite better firefighting technology. The reason is that more people live in the wildland-urban interface, and fires can spread faster than evacuation routes can clear. The question of evacuation is central to the Hinckley story. The trains that escaped the fire were the most successful evacuation in American history up to that point. But they were also a matter of luck. The engineers made decisions in seconds. They had no communication with each other. They had no way to know whether the tracks ahead were intact. They drove into the fire because they had no other choice. Their success was not due to planning. It was due to courage and instinct. The modern system of evacuation relies on planning, but planning cannot account for every variable. The Hinckley Fire showed that even the best-laid plans can fail when the fire moves faster than anyone predicts. What about the people who stayed? Some of them survived in the gravel pit. Others did not. The gravel pit itself became a symbol of both hope and tragedy. Of the 300 people who sheltered there, roughly 200 survived. The rest died from burns or suffocation. The gravel pit was not a safe refuge. The heat was intense enough to melt glass and warp metal. The air was thick with smoke. People who stood up were killed by superheated gases. Those who lay flat on the ground, covering their faces, had a chance. But the experience was so traumatic that many survivors never spoke of it afterward. One survivor, a woman named Anna Bergstrom, wrote a letter to her sister in Sweden 2 weeks after the fire. She described the gravel pit as a hole full of screaming people. She said she had watched a man next to her catch fire and burn alive. She said she had closed her eyes and prayed. She said she had not looked up until the fire was gone. The letter was later published in a Swedish newspaper and is now archived at the Minnesota Historical Society. The psychological impact of the Hinckley Fire was not well understood at the time. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist, but the symptoms were described. Survivors reported nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and a persistent fear of fire. Some could not sleep through the night for years. Others could not tolerate the smell of smoke. Many who had lost family members experienced complicated grief. The mental health care available in 1894 was limited. Asylums were overcrowded. There was no counseling. Survivors were expected to simply continue with their lives. Some did, others did not. The number of suicides in the months after the fire is not known, but local newspapers reported several cases of people who had lost their minds and been committed to the state hospital in St. Peter. The Hinckley Fire also had an economic impact that lasted for decades. The lumber industry, which had been the backbone of the region, was devastated. The mills that had not burned found themselves without a supply of logs. Many closed permanently. The town of Hinckley lost its economic base. It took years for the town to diversify. Some residents turned to farming on the burned land. The soil had been enriched by ash, but the land was also prone to erosion. Others found work in the railroad yards. The railroad remained the largest employer in the area. By 1910, the population had stabilized but had not returned to pre-fire levels. The town had become a quiet stop on the line, a place where travelers got off to stretch their legs and buy sandwiches. The fire was often mentioned in travel guides as a point of interest, but the travelers did not stay long. The legacy of the Hinckley Fire is complex. It is a story of failure and heroism, of systemic neglect and individual bravery. It is a story that continues to resonate because the conditions that caused it have not disappeared. Every hot, dry summer in the upper Midwest carries the same risk. Every lightning strike or errant spark can become the next Hinckley. The difference is that we now have better science, better tools, and better communication. But we also have more people living in fire-prone areas. The tension between development and fire risk is the same tension that existed in 1894. The lessons of Hinckley are not historical artifacts. They are warnings. At 2:17 p.m. on the first day of September 1894, the fire crossed the railroad tracks just north of Hinckley. The tracks were laid on a raised bed of gravel and stone, a barrier that fire crews had hoped would stop the flames. It did not. The fire jumped the tracks in a single surge, carried by a column of superheated air that had been building for hours. Embers the size of baseballs rained down on the other side. Within minutes, the fire was inside the town limits, moving faster than any human could run. What happened in the next hour would determine the fate of over 2,000 people. The fire did not move as a single wall of flame. It moved as a series of erratic pulses, driven by wind shifts and the local topography. At 2:30 p.m., the main body of the fire reached the eastern edge of Hinckley, where a row of wooden houses stood along the railroad right-of-way. The houses were dry. The paint was cracked. The roofs were cedar shingles. The fire ignited them in seconds. People who were still inside their homes had no time to react. Some were found later, still sitting at their kitchen tables, as if they had been frozen in place by the heat. The official death toll from the Hinckley Fire is often given as 418, but that number is almost certainly too low. It counts only the bodies that were recovered and identified. Many were never found. Whole families vanished. In some cases, only a fragment of a bone or a melted button was left behind. The number of missing was never fully tallied. The railroad companies that ran the evacuation trains estimated that about 600 people were aboard their trains, but many of those people were not local. They were travelers passing through, or workers from logging camps, or families from outlying farms who had fled toward the railroad. No one had a complete list. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the way the fire developed. The drought had dried the forest floor to the point where the thick carpet of pine needles and dead leaves acted like tinder. The logging operations had left behind vast piles of slash, branches, bark, and treetops that the lumbermen had no use for. Those piles were concentrated around the rail lines and the mills. When the fire reached them, they exploded. The energy released was equivalent to a small bomb. This is what fire scientists today call a fuel-rich environment. The fire had more material to burn than it could consume in a normal spread. Instead, it created its own weather. The heat rose so fast that it pulled in surface winds from all directions, creating a rotating column that threw burning debris miles ahead of the main front. The term firestorm had not been coined in 1894, but that is exactly what Hinckley experienced. A firestorm is not simply a large fire. It is a fire that generates its own wind system, making it nearly impossible to predict or control. The fire at Hinckley generated winds estimated at over 60 miles per hour within the burn area. Those winds did not come from outside. They were created by the fire itself. This is why the evacuation trains, even at full speed, were almost overtaken. The fire was moving faster than the trains carrying people away. At 2:45 p.m., the fire reached the gravel pit where 300 people had gathered. The gravel pit was a depression in the earth, roughly 10 feet deep, dug by the railroad for ballast. It was not designed as a shelter. People had climbed into it because it seemed like the only place where the fire might pass over them. The fire did pass over them, but not without a cost. The heat in the pit reached an estimated 800 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt the soles of shoes and ignite clothing without direct flame. The survivors who lay flat on the ground, covering their mouths, inhaled superheated air that seared their lungs. Many died within minutes. Some were burned so badly that their bodies could not be identified. One of the survivors, a young man named Oscar E. Anderson, later described the scene in a letter to his brother. He said that the people around him were screaming and then falling silent. He said he saw a woman holding a baby, and then the baby was gone. He did not know what happened to it. He said he pressed his face into the gravel and tried to breathe through the dirt. When the fire passed, he looked up and saw the bodies of dozens of people, their skin blackened, their clothes gone. He crawled out of the pit and walked toward the railroad tracks. He did not look back. The gravel pit story is one of the most harrowing in American fire history. It is also one of the most misunderstood. Some accounts suggest that the pit was a safe refuge, that the fire simply passed over it. That is not true. The pit was a death trap. The heat was so intense that the sand on the floor of the pit became partially vitrified, turned into glass by the extreme temperature. The only reason anyone survived at all was that the fire moved through the pit quickly, in no more than 2 or 3 minutes. If it had lingered, no one would have lived. The investigation that followed the fire was conducted by the Minnesota State Legislature. It began in October 1894 and lasted for several weeks. The committee interviewed witnesses, examined the site, and reviewed the behavior of the railroad companies and the logging firms. The findings were damning but led to no prosecutions. The committee concluded that the fire was caused by a combination of drought, logging slash, and railroad sparks. It recommended that the state establish a forest fire warning system and require railroads to clear flammable debris from their rights-of-way. It also recommended that logging companies be required to dispose of slash in a controlled manner. These recommendations were ignored by most of the industry. The railroad companies argued that they could not be held responsible for a fire that occurred during a drought. They pointed out that the fire spread so fast that any ignition source could have caused it. The logging companies blamed the railroads. Blame game was predictable. No one wanted to pay for the destruction. The insurance companies, which had policies on some of the buildings and lumber mills, refused to pay out on the grounds that the fire was an act of God. The term act of God was a legal loophole that allowed insurers to deny coverage for natural disasters. The survivors had to rely on charity. The American Red Cross, still a young organization, sent funds and supplies. Private donations came in from across the country. But the money was not enough to rebuild the town. In the aftermath, a group of survivors formed the Hinckley Fire Relief Commission. The commission distributed food, clothing, and building materials to those who had lost everything. It also helped to organize the reconstruction of the town. The new Hinckley was built on the same site as the old one. There was no discussion of moving the town to a location with less fire risk. The land was already owned. The railroad was already there. The survivors wanted to stay even if the land was dangerous. They rebuilt their homes, their churches, their schools. They planted new trees in the ashes. They tried to forget what had happened. But forgetting was not possible. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, the survivors gathered at the cemetery. They held a service. They read the names of the dead. They placed flowers on the graves of those who had been buried in mass graves because no one could identify them. The memorial services continued well into the 20th century. The last survivor of the Hinckley Fire, a woman named Margaret Halloran, died in 1988 at the age of 102. She had been 8 years old when the fire came. She remembered the heat on her back and the sound of the trains. The Hinckley Fire was not the only great fire of the 1894 season. That same year, large fires burned across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario. In eastern Washington, the Great Fire of 1894 burned over 1 million acres. In the Pacific Northwest, fires destroyed entire towns. The fire season of 1894 was a nationwide catastrophe. But the Hinckley Fire stood out because of the speed of the fire and the number of people killed in such a small area. It became the subject of newspaper articles, books, and even a popular song. The song, The Hinckley Fire, was written by a traveling musician named Charles P. Shade. It told the story of the fire in plain language, verse by verse, focusing on the heroism of the railroad engineers and the suffering of the families. The song did not mention the systemic failures that had made the fire worse. It did not mention the logging slash or the railroad sparks. It did not mention the lack of fire breaks or the absence of a warning system. The song was a folk ballad, not a report. It captured the emotion but not the cause. That is a pattern that repeats in disaster history. The public remembers the tragedy, the heroism, the loss. It forgets the negligence. What the public also forgets is that the Hinckley Fire could have been prevented, not the drought. No one can prevent a drought. But the fire's intensity and spread could have been reduced. If the logging companies had cleared their slash, the fire would still have burned, but it might not have exploded. If the railroads had installed spark arresters on their locomotives, the number of ignitions would have been lower. If a fire warning system had been in place, the people in the outlying areas might have had time to reach safety. All of these measures were known to be effective. They had been recommended by forestry experts as early as the 1880s, but they were not implemented because they cost money. The companies that owned the forests and the railroads did not want to pay. The question of responsibility is not a simple one. The fire was a natural event, but the disaster was human-made. The line between natural and man-made is blurry in all fire disasters, but in Hinckley, it is particularly clear. The land had been altered by human hands. The forest had been logged. The wood had been piled. The sparks had been thrown. The conditions that turned a small fire into a firestorm were created by people who were not thinking about the consequences. Today, the Hinckley Fire is taught in forestry schools as a case study in fire behavior and land management. It is also taught in engineering schools as an example of how infrastructure can fail under extreme conditions. The railroad tracks that the fire crossed were supposed to be a barrier. They were not. The gravel pit was supposed to be a refuge. It was not. The steam locomotives were supposed to be safe. They caused the fire. Every system that was meant to protect people failed. The failure of the systems is not an accident. It is the result of assumptions that were made without testing. The railroad engineers assumed that their tracks would stop a fire. The townspeople assumed that the gravel pit was deep enough to protect them. The logging companies assumed that their slash piles would not burn until after they had been removed. These assumptions were all wrong. The only way to know for sure is to test them, and the testing in 1894 came too late. The Hinckley Fire also changed the way that people thought about firefighting. Before 1894, firefighting in rural areas was almost entirely volunteer-based. Towns had bucket brigades and hand-pumped engines, but they were designed for structure fires, not wildfires. The idea of fighting a forest fire was alien. Most people believed that forest fires were unstoppable and that the only response was to flee. After Hinckley, that began to change. States started to organize fire patrols. The United States Department of Agriculture began to study fire behavior. The first fire lookout towers were built in the early 1900s. The infrastructure of modern wildfire suppression was born out of the ashes of fires like Hinckley, but the birth was slow. Even after Hinckley, fires continued to devastate the Midwest. In 1908, a fire in northern Minnesota killed 43 people. In 1910, the Great Fire of 1910 killed 87 people in Idaho and Montana. That fire was the catalyst for the creation of the U.S. Forest Service's fire management program. But it was not until after the 1910 fires that the federal government took serious action. The Weeks Act of 1911 allowed the government to purchase land for national forests. The Clark-McNary Act of 1924 provided federal funding for state fire protection. These laws were built on the lessons of Hinckley and other fires, but it took nearly 30 years for them to be enacted. Why 30 years? Because fire prevention is not a political priority when the memory of the fire is fresh but fading. Survivors of Hinckley wanted action, but they were a small group. The industry that had caused the fire fought against regulations. The railroad companies had powerful lobbies. The logging companies had friends in the state legislature. The laws that were passed in Minnesota in 1895 were weak. They required railroads to clear brush from their rights-of-way, but the enforcement was minimal. They created a state fire warden, but the warden had no staff and no budget. The result was that little changed. The same conditions that had allowed the Hinckley Fire to happen remained in place. It was not until the 1910 fires that the public and the government realized that piecemeal state laws were not enough. The 1910 fires burned across multiple states, crossing borders, overwhelming local fire departments. The federal government had to step in. The U.S. Forest Service, which had been created in 1905, was given the authority and the funding to coordinate fire suppression on a national scale. The system that exists today, with firefighting aircraft, smoke jumpers, incident command teams, and early warning systems, traces its roots directly to the response to the fires of 1910. But indirectly, it also traces its roots to Hinckley. Because Hinckley was the first fire to show that a wildfire could be a city killer. It was the first fire to demonstrate that the wildland-urban interface could be lethal. It was the first fire to force the question, how do you evacuate a town when the only way out is through the fire? The answer, as Hinckley showed, is that you do it with trains. The trains saved hundreds of lives, but the trains also nearly killed hundreds of people when they stopped. The lesson is that evacuation routes must be planned and protected. Modern fire evacuations rely on roads, not trains, but the same principle applies. The roads must be cleared. The traffic must be managed. The fire must not be allowed to cut off the route. That is what happened in Hinckley, and it is what happens today in California, Australia, and Greece. The fire will always try to take the same path that people use to escape. The Hinckley Fire is also a story of what happens when a community is isolated. Hinckley in 1894 was not connected to the outside world by telephone or telegraph. The first news of the fire reached the larger cities by train. The survivors who made it to the St. Paul and Duluth stations were the first messengers. They told the police and the newspapers what had happened. The newspapers then telegraphed the story across the country, but the story was incomplete. The reporters who arrived in Hinckley a day later found a scene of devastation that they could not fully describe. The photographs that survive show a landscape of chimneys and ash. There are no photographs of the dead. The newspapers did not publish them out of respect. The public had to imagine what it looked like. The imagination is a powerful thing. The stories that came out of Hinckley were passed down through families. They were written in diaries and letters. They were printed in local histories. The fire became a part of the region's identity. People from Hinckley were proud of the town's resilience. They were proud that it had been rebuilt, but they were also haunted. The fire never left them entirely. It was always there in the back of their minds, especially during a dry summer. The smell of smoke could bring back the panic. Today, the town of Hinckley is a small community of about 2,000 people. It is still a railroad town. The tracks run through the center of town, just as they did in 1894. The trains still stop. The Hinckley Fire Museum is housed in a former railroad depot. The museum contains artifacts from the fire: melted glass, twisted metal, a pocket watch stopped at 2:38 p.m., the time its owner was believed to have died. The museum also has a scale model of the town as it was before the fire, built by a local historian. The model shows the streets, the houses, the mills, and the railroad depot. It is a reminder of what was lost. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, the museum holds a memorial service. The service is small. The survivors are all gone now. The descendants of survivors attend, but they did not live through the fire themselves. The memory is fading. The stories are becoming less detailed. The fire is becoming history, not memory. And history is always at risk of being forgotten or misunderstood. The Hinckley Fire is not just a historical event. It is a warning. The conditions that caused it are still present. The drought cycles are still here. The logging slash is still here. The railroad sparks are still here. The difference is that we now have the science to predict fire behavior and the technology to fight fires. But we also have more people living in fire-prone areas. The population of the United States is 3 times larger than it was in 1894. The wildland-urban interface is huge. A fire like Hinckley today could kill many more people, not because the fire would be worse, but because there are more people in its path. The question that remains is whether we are learning the lessons. The Hinckley Fire taught us that prevention is cheaper than recovery. It taught us that fuel management is essential. It taught us that evacuation plans must be tested. It taught us that systems fail when they are not maintained. It taught us that the people who cause the disaster are often not the ones who pay the price. These lessons have been repeated in every major fire disaster since, from the Peshtigo Fire of 1871 to the Camp Fire of Tuesday. And yet each time the same mistakes are made. The same assumptions are made. The same failures occur. Why? Because the memory of disaster fades. People rebuild. They assume it will not happen again. The forest grows back. New residents move in. They do not know what happened before. In Hinckley, the survivors who rebuilt had a vivid memory of the fire, but their children and grandchildren did not. By 1910, many of the original survivors had moved away or died. The town had a new generation that had never seen the sky turn black at noon. The memorial services became smaller. The stories became less detailed. The fire passed from living memory into recorded history, but the landscape remembered. The aspen and birch that grew after the fire were different from the pine that had been there before. Ecologists later determined that the Hinckley Fire had fundamentally changed the forest composition. The pine forest that had existed for centuries was replaced by a mixed hardwood forest. That new forest was less flammable than the pine forest, at least in the short term, but as the aspen and birch aged, they were replaced by more flammable species. By the 193s, the area was again vulnerable to fire. In 1934, another drought year, a fire broke out near the same region. It burned tens of thousands of acres. It did not kill anyone because the area was less populated, but it was a reminder that the conditions were still present. The Hinckley Fire remains one of the most studied wildfires in American history. Its lessons are not limited to fire prevention. They extend to the way we build our communities, the way we manage our natural resources, and the way we respond to disasters. The fire was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It forced a conversation that had not happened before. It forced people to ask, how do we stop this from happening again? The answers were not perfect, but they were a start. And that start, born in the ashes of a small town in Minnesota, continues to guide us today. On the morning of September 2nd, 1894, the day after the fire, the first relief train arrived from Minneapolis at 7:15 a.m. The train carried doctors, nurses, food, blankets, and coffins. The passengers who had survived the night in the gravel pits and swamps were brought to the depot. The doctors triaged the wounded. The burn injuries were severe. Many survivors had inhaled superheated air, damaging their lungs. The first aid was crude. Morphine was used to ease the pain. The dead were laid out in rows on the platform, covered with sheets. The number of bodies was overwhelming. Volunteer workers dug temporary mass graves. At 10:30 a.m., another train arrived from Duluth. It carried more supplies and a contingent of railroad officials. They had come to assess the damage to the tracks. The fire had burned the wooden trestles. The rails were twisted. The right-of-way was littered with debris. The railroad needed to restore service as quickly as possible. The towns of the region depended on the railroad for everything. Without the trains, there was no way to bring in food, building materials, or relief workers. The railroad surveyors began walking the line. They found that the fire had burned the ties out from under the rails, leaving the steel rails suspended in the air, bent like ribbons. The telegraph poles were gone. The signals were destroyed. The entire infrastructure of the line had to be rebuilt. The railroad brought in crews from other sections. By the end of September, limited service was restored, but full service would take months. The official death toll was reported at 418. But that number was never final. Bodies continued to be found in the woods for weeks. Farmers who had been in their fields, loggers who had been in the camps, travelers who had been on the roads, their remains were discovered piecemeal. The coroner's jury estimated that the true number was closer to 500. Some historians later argued it could have been as high as 600. The uncertainty was part of the tragedy. People simply vanished. The coroner's inquest began on September 4, 1894. The investigation was overseen by a local judge. The first witnesses were the train crews. Engineer Jim Root testified first. He described the drive through the fire, the collapse of the bridges, the 20 minutes of terror. He was asked whether he considered stopping before the fire overtook the train. He said no. He said he believed the only chance was to keep moving. The jurors did not question that decision. The next witnesses were survivors from the gravel pits. They described the river of fire that passed over them. They described the heat, the smoke, the sound of the wind like 1,000 trains. They described watching people run and burn. One woman testified that she had held her baby under a wet blanket. The baby survived. She did not. The testimony was brief. The jurors did not ask many questions. The fire was an act of nature. No one was blamed, but the investigation did examine the cause. The railroad had been using locomotives that threw sparks. The logging companies had left slash piles. The summer had been dry. The state had no fire laws. The railroad was not required to use spark arresters. The logging companies were not required to clean up their debris. The county had no fire warden. The town had no fire department. Every single layer of protection was absent. The inquest concluded that the fire was accidental, caused by a combination of negligence and natural conditions. No one was charged. No one was fined. The railroad later paid voluntary compensation to some families, but there was no legal obligation. The survivors faced a long winter. The town of Hinckley was gone. The houses, stores, churches, schools, and mills were ash. The few buildings that remained were damaged. The people had no shelter. The relief trains brought tents and lumber. A temporary camp was set up on the high ground near the depot. The camp was called Canvas Town. It was a grid of canvas tents with wooden floors. Each family was given one tent. The tents were cold. The winter of 1894 was severe. Snow fell early. The canvas froze. The people burned wood in makeshift stoves. The smoke from the stoves mixed with the smoke from the still smoldering forest. The air was never clean. The relief effort was organized by the state of Minnesota and the railroad. Donations came from all over the country. Cities sent carloads of food and clothing. The American Red Cross, still a young organization, sent a representative. Clara Barton, the founder of the Red Cross, was 67 years old in 1894. She did not come to Hinckley herself, but she organized a relief fund. The Red Cross distributed supplies and medical care. The organization learned from the disaster. The Hinckley Fire was one of the early tests of the Red Cross's ability to respond to a large-scale disaster in a remote area. The lessons learned were applied later in the Johnstown flood and the Galveston hurricane. By the spring of 1895, the rebuilding began. The railroad offered free lumber to anyone who would rebuild in Hinckley. The town was laid out again on the same grid pattern. The streets were wider. The buildings were set farther apart. The town council passed an ordinance requiring metal roofs instead of wooden shingles. The school was rebuilt first, then the churches, then the stores. The saloons were rebuilt later. The people wanted normalcy. They wanted the town to look like it did before. But it never could. The forest was gone. The sawmills had no logs. The lumber industry shifted to other towns. Hinckley became a farming community instead of a logging town. The economy changed. The population never fully recovered. Before the fire, Hinckley had 1,200 people. By 1900, it had 700. The psychological scars were deeper. Survivors reported nightmares for years. The sound of a train whistle could trigger panic. The smell of smoke could cause trembling. Children who had seen their parents burn became orphans. Many were taken in by relatives in other towns. Some were adopted by strangers. The orphan trains, which carried children from eastern cities to Midwestern farms, also brought Hinckley orphans to new homes. The records are incomplete. The children's names were sometimes changed. The past was erased. The long-term ecological impact was studied by the University of Minnesota. In 1895, a botanist named William Bray visited the burn area. He documented the regrowth. He noted that the fire had killed the root systems of many trees. The soil was sterile in places. The erosion was severe. The first rains after the fire washed ash and silt into the streams. The fish died. The water was undrinkable. Bray predicted that it would take 50 years for the forest to return to anything resembling its original state. He was right. The pine forest did not return. The area became a mixed forest of birch, aspen, and oak. The pine came back only in scattered patches. The fire also changed the way people thought about the land. Before the fire, the forest was seen as an infinite resource. The loggers took what they wanted. The settlers cleared the land without regard for the consequences. After the fire, the state began to realize that the forest needed to be managed. The first state forestry laws were passed in 1895. They required loggers to remove slash or pay a fine. The laws were weak and poorly enforced, but they were a start. The idea of sustainable forestry began to take root. But the most important lesson was about communication. The lack of telegraph lines had delayed the warning. After the fire, the railroad and the state collaborated to string telegraph lines along the rail corridors. Every station was equipped with a telegraph key. Every depot agent was trained to send and receive messages. The system was in place by 1896. It was used during the 1910 fires to coordinate evacuations. It was the beginning of a national disaster communication network. The Hinckley Fire also influenced the design of firefighting equipment. The handcars and water barrels used by the railroad men in 1894 were primitive. The fire showed that speed was critical. Within a few years, the railroad companies began equipping their locomotives with water tanks and hoses. They built fire trains that could be dispatched to any point on the line. These fire trains were used for decades. They were the ancestors of modern firefighting aircraft and vehicles. Today, the Hinckley Fire is remembered in textbooks and museum exhibits, but the most powerful memorial is the landscape itself. The Hinckley Fire burn area is now part of the Nemegi State Forest. The trees that grow there are mostly aspen and birch. They are uniform in size, all dating from the same year. A scientist can walk through the forest and identify the fire scar. The soil still contains a layer of charcoal. The charcoal is a record of the disaster. It will be there for centuries. The fire also left a mark on the culture. The phrase, like the Hinckley Fire, was used in Minnesota for generations to describe something fast and destructive. It was a reference point for other disasters. When the Armistice Day blizzard hit in 1940, newspapers compared it to Hinckley. When the 1998 tornadoes struck St. Peter, the comparison was made again. The fire became a benchmark. It defined the worst that could happen. But the fire also defined what could be overcome. The people who rebuilt Hinckley were not extraordinary in any obvious way. They were ordinary people who had lost everything. They had no money, no homes, no tools. They had only each other. They built a new town from the ground up. They buried their dead and planted seeds. They did not give up. That resilience is part of the story, too. It is the part that is hardest to measure but most important to remember. The Hinckley Fire was a disaster born of hubris. The settlers believed that the land was inexhaustible. The loggers believed that the trees would never stop growing. The railroad believed that the sparks would never ignite. The townspeople believed that the fire would never reach them. They were wrong on every count. The fire proved that nature does not care about human belief. It only cares about conditions: aridity, fuel, wind. When those conditions align, the fire will come. The only question is whether we are ready. Are we ready today? The drought cycles are still here. The fuel loads are higher than ever in many forests. The fire season is longer. The climate is warmer. The population in fire-prone areas has exploded. The answer to the question is not reassuring. We have better tools, but we have more risk. The Hinckley Fire was a small town destroyed by a fast-moving flame. The next one could be a small city. The lessons are clear, but they are not always applied. The memory fades. The risk remains. And so the Hinckley Fire continues to matter. It is not just a story about a day in September 1894. It is a story about the limits of human control and the power of natural forces. It is a story about a community that died and a community that survived. It is a story that asks us to look at the landscape and see not just trees, but potential fire. It asks us to look at our towns and see not just homes, but fuel. It asks us to listen to the wind and remember that it can carry destruction. It asks us to prepare because the fire will come again. It always does. End of continuation. On September 2, 1894, the morning after the fire, a special train from St. Paul pulled into what was left of Hinckley. On board were state forestry officials, railroad executives, and a photographer from the Minneapolis Tribune. The platform was ash. The depot was gone. The tracks were warped. The temperature had dropped, but the ground was still hot in places. The party stepped off the train and walked through the ruins. They counted bodies. They measured the depth of the ash. They recorded the distance the fire had traveled. The photographer set up his tripod. The images he captured were the first visual documentation of a large-scale wildfire in the United States. The investigators spent 3 days in the burn zone. They interviewed the survivors who were still in the area. They examined the tree stumps and the direction of the char. They estimated the fire's speed based on the distance between houses that had burned and those that had not. They calculated that the fire had moved at nearly 2 miles per hour through the town. In the open areas, the speed may have been higher. They found that the fire had jumped the St. Croix River, a width of nearly 300 feet. That jump was impossible with a ground fire. It required a crown fire driven by high winds. The investigators also discovered something else. The fire had not started in one place. It had been burning for days across a wide area. Small fires had been reported as early as August 28th. Settlers in the surrounding townships had seen smoke. The railroad had dispatched handcars to put out some of the fires. But the drought was so severe that the fires kept spreading underground through the peat and duff. The surface flames would die down, but the heat persisted. When the wind picked up on September 1st, those underground fires reignited. The entire region was primed. Why had no one warned Hinckley? The telegraph lines were down. The line from Hinckley to Duluth had been broken by the fire itself. The lines to the south were also cut. But the investigators learned that the last message received in Hinckley had been a routine report. No one had sent a warning because no one knew the fire was coming. The fire had moved faster than any message could travel. Even if the telegraph had been working, the information would have arrived too late. The question then became, could the fire have been prevented? The investigators examined the slash piles. They measured the depth of the debris left by the loggers. In some areas, the slash was 4 feet deep. The fire had burned so hot that the soil was baked to a depth of 6 inches. The heat had sterilized the ground. The investigators calculated that the fire had consumed enough wood to fill 4,000 rail cars. That fuel was not natural. It was man-made. It was the result of clear cutting without cleanup. The State Forestry Board issued a report in November 1894. The report was blunt. It stated that the fire was caused by the careless and improvident methods of lumbering. It recommended that all slash be removed or burned under controlled conditions. It recommended that railroad companies be held liable for fires started by their locomotives. It recommended that a statewide fire warning system be established. The report was presented to the Minnesota legislature in January 1895. It was debated. It was amended. It was weakened. The bill that passed required railroad companies to pay a fine if their trains caused fires, but the fine was small. The law did not require slash removal. It simply recommended it. The legislature was still dominated by lumber interests, but the report was not forgotten. It was read by foresters in other states. It was cited in academic papers. It became part of the foundation for the American forestry movement. The men who wrote it, including the botanist William Bray, went on to shape federal fire policy. Bray later worked for the United States Forest Service. He helped design the fire suppression strategies that were used for most of the 20th century. The Hinckley Fire also changed how meteorologists understood wildfire weather. The phenomenon that had occurred on September 1st, a massive column of heated air rising and creating its own wind, was not well understood at the time. After the fire, a Weather Service scientist named Edward Ferguson studied the atmospheric conditions. He took data from the records in St. Paul and Duluth. He reconstructed the wind patterns. He realized that the fire had created a low-pressure system of its own. The column of hot air had drawn in oxygen from all directions. The wind had not been steady. It had swirled. That is why the fire had moved in different directions at different times. Ferguson published his findings in an academic journal in 1896. His work was one of the first scientific studies of fire behavior. It was used by later researchers studying the Peshtigo Fire and the Great Fire of 1910. The fire also prompted changes in insurance. Before 1894, most policies in Minnesota did not cover fire damage caused by acts of God or by railroad negligence. After the fire, the insurance companies revised their contracts. They began requiring property owners to maintain defensible space around their buildings. They raised premiums in high-risk areas. They also created a fund for emergency relief. The insurance industry learned that it was cheaper to pay for prevention than to pay for destruction. But the most enduring change was in the minds of the people who lived through it. The survivors carried the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. They passed it down to their children. They told the story at family gatherings and in newspaper interviews. The story evolved. Some details were exaggerated, others were forgotten, but the core remained the same. A fire came out of the forest. It killed without warning. It took everything. And the people who survived had to start over from nothing. That story is still told today. It is told in schools and in historical societies. It is told by descendants of survivors. It is told by firefighters who study the history of their profession. The Hinckley Fire is not just a date on a calendar. It is a lesson written in the soil. It is a warning that the forest is not tame. It is a reminder that we are not in control. We live on the edge of a landscape that can burn. That is the truth. The fire taught it. The silence after the fire confirmed it. And the wind, when it blows dry and hot, still carries that lesson with it.